The lonely desert. The twin suns of Zilia hung low in the sky, their fiery light casting a relentless heat over the vast, lifeless desert. The golden sand stretched endlessly, undulating in waves across the barren landscape, where the sun's scorching rays turned the earth into a furnace. Sergeant Tom Grady, a battle-hardened soldier of the Earth Coalition, squinted against the blinding glare. His weathered face, marked by countless scars and years of service, was grim as he trudged forward, his boots sinking into the soft sand with every step. The weight of his gear felt heavier with each movement, the constant friction of the hot winds searing his skin. This was supposed to be a routine patrol, part of the early colonization efforts for Earth's newest off-world expansion. Tom was used to the loneliness of space and the harshness of alien planets, but this place, this barren wasteland, was unlike any world he'd ever encountered. The planet, named Zilia, had once shown promise during preliminary scans, with signs of ancient life buried beneath the dunes. But now, after the catastrophic sandstorm had separated him from his unit, it felt like nothing more than a deserted graveyard, haunted by the bones of long-dead creatures. Tom's canteen was nearly empty, and the heat was unbearable. His lips were cracked, and every breath he took felt dry, as if the air itself was trying to drain the life from him. His radio was useless, lost to the storm, and his only companion was the sound of his own footfalls crunching in the sand. The miles seemed endless, and the horizon was a never-ending blur of golden dunes. Still, Tom's training kept him moving. The Earth Coalition had drilled into his mind the importance of perseverance, of never giving up, no matter how dire the situation. He scanned the barren horizon again, hoping for any sign of shelter or water. But there was nothing, only the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. His thoughts drifted to his comrades, lost in the chaos of the sandstorm, wondering if any of them had survived. The situation was grim, and if he didn't find shelter soon, he might not make it. Just as he was beginning to doubt his chances, something caught his eye. A faint movement on the edge of his vision. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. Something small, something out of place in this desolate landscape. Tom's instincts flared. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and began moving toward it, his pace quickening despite the fatigue weighing down on him. His heart raced in his chest as he fought the burning sensation in his legs. Could it be a sign of life, a glimmer of hope in this sea of sand? As he drew closer, his eyes locked onto the figure. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a twisted shadow, something formed by the light playing tricks on his mind. But the closer he got, the clearer the shape became. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. At first, Tom's breath caught in his throat. The figure lay crumpled at the base of a dune, partially buried by sand. A tiny, delicate form, almost childlike, with silver hair scattered like a halo around her head, and skin that shimmered in the harsh sunlight, as though it were made of glass. Tom hesitated, his instincts screaming that this could be a trap. But as he approached cautiously, his eyes narrowing in scrutiny, he saw the faintest rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, barely. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who was she? How had she ended up here in this inhospitable place? And more importantly, how could she survive in this brutal desert? His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he gently brushed the sand from her face. She looked fragile, almost impossibly so. Her skin, though beautiful and delicate, bore signs of extreme dehydration, her lips cracked and dry. Despite her alien appearance, her features were hauntingly human. Her eyes remained closed, but Tom noticed how the faintest glow radiated from her delicate eyelids, as if the very life force within her was fighting to stay alive. "Hey," Tom murmured softly, his voice rough from the dry air. "Can you hear me? You're going to be okay. Just hang in there." He reached for his canteen, unscrewing the lid with a swift motion. Tom knew he couldn't waste any more time, not with the sun rapidly descending, turning the air even hotter. As he brought the canteen to her lips, she flinched, her small hands twitching slightly, but she didn't resist. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that shimmered like the surface of a moonlit lake, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. At first, her gaze was unfocused, filled with confusion and terror, but as her vision cleared, her eyes locked onto Tom's, wide with uncertainty. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, after a long pause, she whispered, her voice soft, almost melodic, though heavy with weakness. "Why are you here?" she asked, her words fragile, as though each one took all the energy she had left. Tom felt a pang of sorrow in his chest. He had no answers for her. Why was he here? Was it fate? Was it sheer chance? He didn't know. He just knew that she needed help, and he was the only one there to offer it. "I could ask you the same thing," Tom replied, offering her a weak smile. "This planet is no place for anyone, especially someone like you. But I'm not going to leave you here." Her eyes flickered with something, doubt, fear, or perhaps disbelief. But Tom didn't give her the chance to speak again. His eyes quickly scanned their surroundings, noting the vast emptiness that stretched out in every direction. The nearest shelter was miles away, and he wasn't sure he could make it back to his camp without collapsing himself. But he had no choice. Tom scooped the tiny woman into his arms, her fragile form lighter than he had expected, like carrying a child. She didn't resist, her small body limp against his chest as he rose to his feet. The journey back would be long and grueling, but he wouldn't abandon her here. Not after what he had just seen. She had been left to die, abandoned in this merciless desert, with no one to care for her. As he began the slow trek back toward his makeshift camp, the desert wind whipped around them, stinging his skin. The blazing suns overhead were unforgiving, the heat oppressive. The sand beneath his feet shifted with every step, threatening to drag him down into the depths of the unforgiving landscape. But Tom didn't falter. With the tiny, dying alien woman in his arms, he pressed on. She had no one else. And for now, he was all she had. The journey was exhausting, and every step felt like an eternity. Tom's muscles screamed for relief, but he knew there was no time to waste. They needed shelter, they needed water, and they needed each other. He would not let her die here. The desert's mercy. The sun was beginning to set as Tom made his way across the dunes, his muscles burning with exhaustion. He had walked for hours, but the desert seemed endless, its sprawling golden expanse mocking his every effort. The weight of the tiny alien woman in his arms seemed to grow heavier with each step, though her body was light and fragile. Her skin, delicate like porcelain, felt warm against his chest, a reminder of the life he was trying to save. Her breathing, shallow and ragged, was the only sound that filled the air, aside from the constant, distant howling of the wind. The silence of the desert was deafening, broken only by the occasional murmur from the woman in his arms, her voice too soft for him to understand. Her words were in a language he didn't recognize, and Tom had no way of knowing whether she was speaking to him or simply to herself, lost in delirium. "Come on," Tom muttered, more to himself than to her, his throat dry. "We're almost there." His camp, such as it was still far off in the distance, just a small structure made from salvaged materials. An emergency shelter, something temporary. It had been hastily erected when he first arrived, just enough to give him some protection from the harsh elements, but he had never expected to use it in such a way. As Tom approached the shelter, he could feel the desert wind picking up, the temperature beginning to drop. The day was fading fast, and the night would be just as unforgiving as the day had been. Still, he pushed forward, determined to get her to safety. The sand had already begun to cool, but the wind still bit at his skin like knives. "Almost there," he whispered again, this time to reassure the woman in his arms. But she was slipping in and out of consciousness, her grip on his jacket loose and feeble. When they finally reached the shelter, Tom gently set her down on the small cot he had set up inside. Her body was so fragile that it seemed to sink into the fabric, as though she would disappear into the air itself. He hurriedly grabbed his canteen and offered her a few more sips of water, watching as she hesitated, her trembling hands fumbling with the canteen before drinking. Her large, luminous eyes flickered open, and she stared up at him, a faint look of confusion still clouding her gaze. Tom could tell she was trying to process everything, but it seemed as though her mind was trapped in a haze, unable to make sense of her surroundings. "Why did they leave me?" she whispered, her voice fragile, barely above a whisper. Tom's heart sank. He had hoped she wouldn't remember the horrors of her abandonment so soon. Her voice, filled with a pain that cut deeper than any weapon, was a stark reminder of the cruelty she had suffered. The idea that someone, or perhaps a whole race, could leave her to die in such a place was incomprehensible. But Tom had learned in his time as a soldier that some things defied explanation, that the actions of others could be harsh, cruel, and senseless. "They didn't care for you, did they?" Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whoever they are, they were wrong." Her gaze dropped to the sand at her feet, and Tom knew that the weight of the pain she carried was too heavy for words. The silence between them stretched out, broken only by the soft wind outside and the occasional creak of the shelter. Tom tried not to focus on the pit in his stomach, the fear that gnawed at him that he wouldn't be able to save her, that she would be lost to the desert, and the cruelty of her people's abandonment. But there was something else he noticed, something that made him hesitate for a moment. The glow in her eyes. It wasn't just a sign of life, it was something more. It was as though her very essence, her being, was tied to the planet itself. She wasn't from Earth. That much was clear. But even now, as she lay here in the shelter, there was a strange, ethereal energy surrounding her, an energy that made Tom wonder just how different she was from anything he had ever encountered. "You said they left you because you're weak," Tom said after a moment, his voice softening. "But you're not weak. You're alive, and you've got more fight in you than they could ever understand." Larry didn't look at him, but her eyes flickered, the faintest spark of hope dancing within them. The words, though simple, seemed to give her some comfort, some reprieve from the crushing weight of rejection that had haunted her. For a long moment, Tom sat there, watching her. She was still so fragile, but there was a quiet strength in her, a resolve that hadn't been completely extinguished by her abandonment. And for the first time since the storm had separated him from his unit, Tom didn't feel so alone. He had never been one to feel sorry for himself, but the isolation of this mission, this God-forsaken desert, had left him with a gnawing emptiness. And now, with Larry lying before him, his purpose had shifted. He was no longer just a soldier, lost in the wilds of an alien planet. He was a lifeline, the one who would help her survive, the one who would fight to keep her safe. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and the desert seemed to come alive with the sound of the wind. The air was thick with the promise of more danger, but Tom wasn't worried about that right now. Right now, his focus was solely on Larry, the tiny alien woman who had been cast aside and left to die. He had promised himself that he wouldn't leave her behind, that he would protect her from whatever had brought her to this desolate place. And as the night closed in around them, Tom made a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would make sure she didn't die alone in this desert. The stars began to twinkle in the sky above, distant and cold, but the shelter was warm, the light inside flickering as the wind howled outside. Tom sat beside Larry, his hand resting lightly on her frail shoulder, as they waited in silence, hoping against hope that the dawn would bring with it the possibility of a new beginning. Shadows of the past. The following day dawned slowly, the first rays of the twin suns creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. The desert, though harsh and unforgiving, had its own beauty, and for a moment, Tom allowed himself to pause and appreciate it. The vast, open sky, tinged with hues of orange and pink, felt like an expanse of endless possibilities, a reminder that there was still a world beyond the desolation. But the weight of the situation pressed down on him once again. He had a duty now, not just to himself, but to Leary, the tiny alien woman he had found in the sand. The sun was already climbing higher, bringing with it the promise of another scorching day. Tom glanced over at the small cot where Leary still lay, her delicate form barely stirring as she slept. She had been restless through the night, her fevered murmurs punctuated by the occasional guttural sob. The torment she had endured, alone in the desert, abandoned by her own people, was more than most could bear. It was a wound that ran deep, a pain that Tom could not easily erase. He rose to his feet, careful not to disturb her. The shelter was sparse, just a few salvaged materials and the cot, but it was enough for now. Tom moved toward his pack, rummaging through its contents. The nutrients bars he had brought from Earth were mostly gone, and his water supply was dangerously low. He knew he had to find a way to replenish his resources soon, but the thought of leaving Leary alone, vulnerable in this hostile environment, gnawed at him. As he stood there, his mind wandered back to the moment he had found her, lying half-buried in the sand. The image of her frail body, abandoned like so much debris, was burned into his mind. How could her people, whatever race they were, have left her like that? How could they have so callously discarded her as though she was nothing more than a burden? Tom felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he quickly pushed it down. Anger wouldn't help them survive. The desert was indifferent to their plight. It didn't care whether they lived or died. Survival was the only thing that mattered now, and he couldn't afford to waste energy on things he couldn't change. Leary stirred on the cot, and Tom turned his attention back to her. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly in the dim light of the shelter. She blinked a few times, as though trying to shake off the remnants of a nightmare, and then her gaze fixed on him. The vulnerability in her eyes struck him, and for a moment he wondered what she was thinking. Was she afraid of him, of the situation they were in, or was she still lost in the horrors of her past, the memory of her abandonment haunting her every thought? "Good morning," Tom said gently, crouching down beside her. He offered her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't come easily. He was tired, his mind still reeling from the bizarre turn of events that had led him here. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. She was weak, fragile, and her body was still fighting to recover from the effects of dehydration and exhaustion. Leary's lips parted, but no words came out at first. She blinked again, and her eyes seemed to refocus on him. Slowly, she raised her hand, reaching for the canteen at his side. Her fingers trembled, and her expression was strained, as though the effort of speaking or even moving was too much for her. "Water," she murmured, her voice hoarse. Tom nodded and quickly unscrewed the cap, bringing the canteen to her lips. She drank greedily, her small hands clutching the canteen as though it were a lifeline. Tom waited patiently, his gaze never leaving her face, watching as she drank in small, measured sips. When she finally pulled away, her eyes met his again, and there was a flicker of something deeper in them, something he couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Tom smiled again, though the gesture felt foreign, given the gravity of their situation. "You don't have to thank me. You're not alone anymore. I'll make sure you get through this." There was a long pause, during which neither of them spoke. The air inside the shelter felt thick, heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of their shared isolation. It wasn't just the desert that had abandoned her. It was her own people. Her own kind had cast her aside because she wasn't strong enough, or big enough, or whatever criteria they held dear. The very notion of leaving someone behind, especially to die alone in a place like this, was incomprehensible to Tom. He couldn't fathom the cruelty that would allow someone to treat another living being like that. Finally, Leary broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "They left me because I was too small, too weak." Tom's brow furrowed. "Is that how they see you? As weak?" Leary nodded slowly, her large eyes filling with sorrow. "In my world, strength and size are everything. If you're small or frail, you're seen as less, not worthy of survival. Her voice trembled as she spoke, as though the very memory of her people's rejection brought pain to her heart. I've always been small, fragile. I never fit in. Tom felt a pang of sympathy. He had seen it all too often. Societies that valued physical strength over other qualities, where the weak were cast aside and left to fend for themselves. But hearing Larry speak of her abandonment, of her people's cold indifference, hit him harder than he expected. "That's not right," Tom said quietly, his voice firm. "You're not weak. You're still here. You're alive, and that makes you stronger than anyone who would leave you behind." Larry met his gaze, her eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time since Tom had found her, there was a flicker of hope in her expression, something that hinted at the possibility of healing, of finding a place where she might belong. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Tom didn't push her for an answer. Instead, he sat down next to her, his gaze turning to the makeshift shelter they had found refuge in. The walls, made from scavenged materials, were beginning to show signs of wear. The shelter wasn't permanent, and neither was their situation. Tom knew they couldn't stay here forever. "We need to find a way off this planet," Tom said, his voice low. "We can't survive here for long. Not with the sandstorms and the heat, and not without supplies." Larry nodded slowly, her eyes distant, as though she was contemplating something deep within herself. "I don't know if my people can help us," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "They might not even care that I'm alive." Tom shook his head, his jaw tightening. "We won't depend on them. We'll find our own way." For a brief moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was an understanding now, an unspoken bond that had formed between them. Tom wasn't just protecting her. He was fighting for her right to exist, for her right to survive. And somehow, Larry wasn't just some fragile alien he had stumbled upon. She had become someone he cared about, someone whose survival he was willing to fight for. As the desert winds howled outside the shelter, and the harsh sunlight began to climb higher in the sky, Tom knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. They had a long way to go, and the challenges ahead would be greater than anything they had yet faced. But for the first time, Tom felt something other than isolation. He felt hope, a spark that had been reignited in the most unlikely of places. And in that moment, amidst the endless sands of Zilia, Tom vowed to do whatever it took to help Larry find her place in the universe. No matter how impossible it seemed, they would survive together. The journey beyond. The sun had reached its zenith by the time Tom and Larry stepped outside the shelter, the heat of the desert pressing down on them like a suffocating weight. The air shimmered with the intensity of the twin suns as they cast long shadows across the dunes. The vastness of Zilia stretched endlessly before them, an unforgiving landscape that had already claimed so much. Yet, amidst the barren beauty, there was a sense of determination in the air. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting for something greater than mere survival, hope, and the possibility of a future, no matter how uncertain. Tom took a deep breath, squinting against the blinding light. His canteen was half empty, and his provisions were sparse. The journey ahead would be grueling. The only way to find help or resources was to venture further into the desert, where danger lurked at every corner. But it was a risk they had to take. They couldn't stay in the shelter forever. It was only a temporary haven, one that could not offer them what they truly needed: answers, safety, and a way off this forsaken planet. Larry, though still fragile and weak, stood beside him. Her small frame was cloaked in a makeshift robe made from the remnants of Tom's supplies, offering her some protection from the scorching heat. Her silver hair caught the light as she adjusted her stance, her luminous eyes scanning the desert horizon with a quiet intensity. She wasn't the same woman he had carried into the shelter just days before. There was a fire in her now, a flicker of strength that hadn't been there before. "We can't stay here," Larry said, her voice soft but resolute. "If my people are out there, we need to find them. But if not, then we have to find another way off this planet. Tom nodded. He could sense the change in her, the shift from fear and uncertainty to determination. It was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't just relying on him to save her anymore. She had become part of the plan, part of the fight for their future. "You're right," he replied. "The longer we wait, the less chance we have of making it. We need to move out and find some answers, whether it's your people or something else." With that, they began their journey once again, walking side by side across the desolate expanse. The desert had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, as if the very earth beneath your feet was trying to swallow you whole. Every step felt like an eternity. But with each step, Tom found himself more resolved. He had seen the worst humanity had to offer on the battlefield, but what he saw in Lyri's eyes, her resilience, her will to survive, was a reminder of the strength that lay beyond the physical. It wasn't size or power that mattered. It was the will to live, the will to keep fighting, no matter how dire the odds. The blistering wind howled around them as they continued their trek, the shifting sands making each step harder than the last. Tom could feel the weight of his gear pressing down on him, the oppressive heat making each breath harder to take. The air was thick with dust, and his skin felt like it was cracking under the relentless assault of the sun. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Lyri, though small and frail, kept pace with him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had grown stronger in the days since they'd met, but she was still fragile. The dehydration and exhaustion from her time in the desert had left their mark on her, and Tom knew that he couldn't push her too hard. He kept an eye on her, making sure she didn't falter, keeping her close as they made their way across the endless sea of sand. Hours passed, and the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the dunes once more. They had made some progress, but it wasn't enough. Tom knew that if they didn't find shelter before nightfall, they would be exposed to the full fury of the desert. But just as doubt began to creep into his mind, something caught his eye in the distance. A structure. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that they were on the right path. Tom's heart quickened as he motioned for Lyri to follow. The structure was small, a solitary building, half buried in the sand, its silhouette standing out against the setting sun. It was clearly old, abandoned, and weathered by time, but it was a chance, an opportunity for rest, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. The two of them quickened their pace, moving toward the building as fast as they could, the wind picking up once again, pushing against them as if trying to keep them from their goal. As they neared the structure, Tom's sense of caution heightened. There was no telling what dangers this place might hold. It could be abandoned, or it could be home to something far worse. They reached the entrance of the structure and paused, scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. There was nothing, just the stillness of the desert and the soft hum of the wind. With a final glance at Lyri, Tom pushed open the rusted door, which creaked loudly, sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, but there was shelter, and there was safety, at least for the moment. The inside of the structure was nothing more than a small room, its walls lined with weathered metal and broken panels. The faintest light filtered through cracks in the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was clear that this place had once been some kind of outpost or research facility, but now it was little more than a forgotten relic, left to the mercy of the desert. Tom closed the door behind them, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. He could feel his muscles protesting, the strain of the journey weighing on him, but he couldn't afford to rest for too long. Lyri collapsed onto a pile of debris, her breath ragged, and Tom knelt beside her, checking her condition once again. Her skin had grown even paler, and her eyes were glassy, but she was still conscious. Her breathing was shallow, but she was still alive. Tom felt a surge of relief at the sight. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, trying to reassure her. "We'll figure out what to do next. But for now, just rest." Lyri nodded weakly, her luminous eyes drifting shut as she succumbed to exhaustion. Tom sat beside her, his mind racing with possibilities. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving place, but there was something about it that felt almost alive, as though the land itself was watching them, testing them. His thoughts drifted back to her people, to the ones who had abandoned her. Why had they done it? Was it really because she was small and weak, or was there more to the story? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper hidden beneath the surface. Whatever had driven her people to cast her aside, he was determined to find answers. The night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped, but inside the structure, they were shielded from the worst of the desert's bite. Tom kept watch, his senses on high alert, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon as the wind howled outside. The silence of the night felt oppressive, but it was also a welcome relief. For now, they were safe. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. The desert had shown them mercy, but it was a mercy that came at a cost. They would have to keep moving forward, no matter the dangers, no matter the odds. But with each step, he could feel something growing inside him. An unwavering sense of purpose, a fierce determination to protect Leary and to make sure that, no matter what, she wouldn't have to face the desert alone. The secrets beneath the sand. The next morning, the sun rose higher, bringing with it the oppressive heat of another day on Zelia. Tom awoke to the sound of the wind shifting outside the makeshift shelter. The structure had offered them a brief respite, but the desert was never truly still, and it seemed as though the land itself was constantly shifting, breathing, and testing its inhabitants. Tom's eyes flickered open, and for a moment, he stared up at the cracked ceiling of the derelict building, the weight of the journey bearing down on him. He had no illusions about their survival. It was a constant battle against the elements, against exhaustion, and against the overwhelming sense of isolation that gnawed at his thoughts. Larry, still lying beside him, seemed to be in a deeper sleep, her breathing even but faint. Tom's gaze softened as he watched her, her frail form still pale, her energy clearly depleted. Despite her resilience, despite the spark of life he had seen in her since their first meeting, she was still fragile. He knew that this desert, this brutal, unforgiving wasteland, had no mercy for the weak. And though she had survived so far, Tom could see the toll it was taking on her, how every step she took was an effort, every breath a struggle. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb her, and moved toward the edge of the shelter. Outside, the desert stretched out before him, endless dunes rolling toward the horizon. The heat was already unbearable, and the golden sands shimmered under the sun's blistering gaze, but there was something different in the air today, something that set Tom's instincts on edge. It was subtle at first, a strange vibration in the ground, a slight tremor that he could feel beneath his boots. It was as if the desert was shifting, as if the land itself was waking up. Tom frowned, narrowing his eyes as he scanned the horizon. It could have been a trick of the wind, the desert playing its cruel games with his mind. But the feeling gnawed at him, and he trusted his instincts. There was something more to this planet, something hidden beneath the surface, something that called to him. He turned back to the shelter, his mind racing. He couldn't leave Leary behind, not in her current state, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. There was something buried out there, something he had to find. Whatever it was, it could be the key to their survival. Maybe it was the answer to everything. And as he looked at Leary, her face peaceful for the moment, he made up his mind. He would go, just for a short while, and see if he could uncover the source of that feeling. He wouldn't take unnecessary risks, but he couldn't ignore this nagging sense that they were meant to find whatever lay hidden in the sand. Tom grabbed his gear and slung it over his shoulder, then turned back to Leary. He paused, watching her, his heart heavy with concern. She was so fragile, so far from the fierce strength he had seen in her eyes during their journey. Yet he knew she would not want to be left behind. She had been abandoned once by her people, but that wasn't going to be his choice. Not now, not ever. He walked over to her, kneeling beside the cot. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his movement, and she looked at him with a dazed expression. "Where are you going?" Her voice was faint, but there was a note of concern in it. Tom smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Just a short walk. I need to check something. Don't worry. I'll be back soon." Lyri's eyes seemed to study him for a moment, her gaze searching, trying to read him. "What's out there?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity. Tom hesitated, not wanting to worry her, but she had a right to know. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, "but something's different today. I feel like there's something we need to find, something buried in this desert. I just need to take a look." Lyri looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Her eyes softened. "Be careful." "I will," Tom promised, standing up and adjusting his pack. "Stay here and rest. I won't be gone long." With one last glance at Lyri, he left the shelter, stepping into the harsh, unrelenting heat of the desert. The sun beat down on him immediately, its intensity nearly overwhelming. But he was used to it. He had endured worse on Earth's worst battlefields. This was different, though. The vast emptiness of the desert had a way of playing tricks on the mind, of making the world feel smaller, more claustrophobic, despite its vastness. The strange tremor he had felt earlier seemed to reverberate in the ground again, more pronounced this time. Tom's boots crunched in the sand as he moved across the dunes, scanning the horizon. There was nothing to see, just miles and miles of sand, the occasional rocky outcropping, and the distant silhouette of the shelter behind him. But something in his gut told him that the source of that vibration wasn't far. He felt drawn toward it, an almost magnetic pull that urged him forward. Hours passed, the relentless sun hanging high above, and still Tom pressed on, his gaze never wavering from the shifting sands. The terrain began to change subtly as he moved deeper into the desert, the dunes growing larger, the sand more treacherous underfoot. He was getting closer, and then suddenly it appeared. An opening in the sand, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable once he was near it. It was the faintest outline of a structure, something that had been buried beneath the sands for centuries, perhaps millennia. The walls, made from some kind of smooth metallic material, gleamed faintly in the sunlight. A structure, long forgotten, hidden beneath the desert's ever-shifting surface. Tom felt his heart quicken. This was it. This was what he had felt, what had drawn him here. Without hesitation, he moved toward it, digging through the sand with his hands, desperate to uncover more. It wasn't easy. The sand seemed to fight him, falling back into place as quickly as he could clear it. But his determination was unwavering. He knew this discovery could mean the difference between life and death for both him and Lyri. It took hours, but finally, after what felt like an eternity of digging, the entrance became fully visible. The metal was pitted and rusted with age, but there was no mistaking it. It was a door, a doorway into something far older than the planet itself. Tom's breath caught as he stared at it. His mind raced with possibilities. What was inside? Who had built this place? And why had it been buried? He stepped back, his hand trembling as he reached out to push open the door. It creaked loudly as it shifted, revealing a dark, narrow corridor. Tom hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The cool air inside the structure a welcome relief from the suffocating heat outside. The interior of the structure was a stark contrast to the harsh desert. The walls were lined with strange symbols and markings, none of which Tom recognized. The floor was smooth, and there were remnants of old, broken equipment scattered across the room. It was clear that whoever had built this place was long gone. Tom took a deep breath, the sense of discovery flooding him. There was something important here, something worth fighting for. As he moved further into the structure, he couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was just the beginning, that whatever secrets lay hidden within these walls would change everything. But as he ventured deeper into the mysterious structure, He couldn't help but wonder. Would the answers he found here be enough to save him and Leary? Or would the desert's cruel grasp tighten around them once again? The secrets beneath the sand were waiting to be uncovered. And with them, the fate of everything they had fought for. Unearthing the truth. The darkness inside the ancient structure was oppressive, like a heavy blanket that smothered everything it touched. Tom moved cautiously, his boots making no sound on the smooth metallic floor. The air was cool and stale, filled with the scent of age and forgotten memories. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw more details: broken equipment, rusted panels, and walls lined with strange symbols and carvings that hinted at a long-forgotten civilization. Whoever had built this place, they were gone now, leaving only the echoes of their existence behind. The walls were covered in intricate designs, patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Tom couldn't make sense of them. They were not like anything he had ever seen, not from any human culture or any alien species he had encountered. The shapes were fluid, organic in nature, almost as if they were part of the living fabric of the planet itself. His fingers brushed against one of the symbols, and for a brief moment, a shock of energy ran through him. Though it didn't hurt, it felt connected, like a thread linking him to something much bigger than himself. He took a step back, shaking off the strange sensation. This wasn't the time to get distracted. He had a mission, one that now seemed more critical than ever. His pulse quickened as he moved deeper into the structure, his eyes scanning for anything that might reveal the purpose of this place. The corridor opened up into a larger room, its high ceiling supported by massive pillars made of the same strange material as the walls. At the center of the room, there was a pedestal, and upon it, something that caught Tom's attention immediately. It was a small device, glowing faintly with a soft blue light, a stark contrast to the dark, decaying surroundings. The device was unlike anything Tom had ever seen. It had no discernible buttons or markings, only smooth curved surfaces, and an aura of power that seemed to hum softly in the air around it. Tom approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got to the pedestal, the more intense the hum became, until it was almost deafening. He reached out slowly, his fingers hovering just above the glowing device. Something inside him told him to touch it, that doing so would unlock the answers he so desperately sought. But there was a hesitation, a nagging doubt that kept him from making the final move. Before he could make a decision, a voice, soft, almost like a whisper, echoed through the room. It was alien in nature, unfamiliar, but somehow it felt like it was speaking directly to him, to his very soul. "You should not be here." Tom froze, his hand still hovering over the device. His mind raced. Who was that? Was it an automated message? A recording left by whoever had built this place? The voice didn't sound like it was coming from any speaker. It felt like it was coming from within him, echoing through his thoughts. The words were clear, though urgent. "Turn back. Leave this place." Tom swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to leave, to turn around and go back to the shelter with Leary. But a part of him, a deeper part, told him to stay, to press on, to find the truth. He couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. He had to know what was behind all of this, what had happened to this place and its creators, and what connection it had to Leary's people. He shook off the voice, forcing himself to concentrate. This wasn't a time for fear or uncertainty. The desert had pushed him to his limits. Leary had endured so much already, and now they were this close to uncovering something that could change everything. He had come too far to let something as intangible as a voice stop him. With a deep breath, Tom reached down and touched the device. The instant his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, a flood of sensations that overwhelmed his senses. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to warp around him. He staggered backward, instinctively pulling his hand away from the device. But the sensation lingered, like a force that was still pulling at him from deep within the structure. As the world around him settled, Tom's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His heart pounded in his chest as the room slowly returned to its original state. The soft hum of the device had stopped, and the atmosphere in the room felt strangely heavy. But something had changed. He could feel it, as if the very air was now charged with new energy. Suddenly, the walls around him seemed to shift, the strange symbols on the walls glowing faintly. The symbols, those same patterns that had seemed so incomprehensible before, now felt like they were speaking to him, almost as if they were alive. He reached out, touching one of the glowing symbols, and as his fingers brushed against it, a holographic image sprang to life in front of him. It was a map. No, not just a map. A star chart showing a network of planets scattered across the galaxy, with lines connecting them in intricate patterns. There were markings on several of the planets, including one that was clearly labeled with a symbol Tom recognized: Earth. And next to Earth's mark was another symbol, this one different from the others, alien and unfamiliar. It was a marking he had seen before in Lyri's eyes. It was the same glow, the same shape that had been in her irises when he first found her. A connection, a sign that the two were linked. Tom's mind raced. What was this map? Was it showing the location of Lyri's people? And why was Earth marked here, so far from the edge of known space? The answers were just out of reach, and yet the more Tom looked at the map, the clearer it became. There was something greater at work here, something ancient, something far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Before he could process what he was seeing, the map flickered and shifted, the symbols and lines rearranging into a new form. This time, the hologram was a scene, an image of a vast city, towering structures reaching up toward a darkened sky. The streets were crowded with beings from various species, some humanoid, others entirely alien. But in the center of the image, there was one being that stood apart, a figure, smaller than the others, with silver hair and eyes that glowed faintly, just like Lyri's. It was Lyri. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he realized that this image wasn't just a projection of the past. It was a memory, a vision of what had happened, a glimpse of Lyri's people and their society. The small figure in the center was her, and the scene was playing out in front of him like a ghostly replay of a forgotten history. The voice that had spoken to him before returned, now clearer than ever. "She is the key," it said. "The one who was cast aside. The one who will change the course of history. You must protect her." The voice seemed to fade as the vision vanished, leaving Tom standing alone in the dark room. The map was gone. The symbols faded back into the walls, and the oppressive silence of the desert outside filled the space once more. Tom stood there for a long moment, his mind spinning. Lyri was more than just a survivor. She was a piece of something much bigger, a piece of a puzzle that, once completed, could shift the very balance of power in the galaxy. He turned, his decision already made. He had to return to her. He had to make sure that Lyri understood what he had just learned. Because whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers they would face, he knew one thing for certain: he would fight to protect her. She wasn't just another abandoned soul in the desert. She was the future.